Okay, so it is 4 o'clock. I think we should probably get started. Neil will get here when Neil gets here. So, this is Reagan. She is with the Library of Virginia, and she is here to give us information about board success. You're up.
Okay. Sorry, I can kind of see some people, but you're in a very, very tiny screen on my computer. So just for your knowledge, if I'm not looking directly into the camera, it's because my presentation's on a different screen. I have 2 screens here, so it's not that I'm not paying attention. Just all my things are on a different screen. So I was at Jameson in May, so if there are folks in the room who were at that meeting, you will probably see things that are very, very similar. In some cases that'll be good, it'll just help cement things. There is about 2 new slides in there, just some new information, but ultimately it's pretty much what I did back in May. But I'm happy to do it again. I know you got some new board members, so it's always wonderful to be able to have a chance to speak to those folks as well. So, my name is Reagan Thalker. I am the Public Library Consultant with the Library Development Division here in the Library of Virginia. I am part of, sure my slides are moved. Here we go. I am part of a team of 6 here, and we all kind of cover different areas in what we do. In my particular area, I cover folks like the Board of Trustees, your library directors, your Friends of Library groups, and your foundation groups. So that is why you are hearing from me today. Our division in and of itself is funded through the Library Services and Technology Act of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is part of the Federal Department of Education. Our funding comes from that particular thing. So if you've ever heard anybody in kind of the library world talk about LSTA funding, that is, some of it comes to us. There's other pieces that go to other states across the United States. So. On the screen there, you have a little bit of like our division's values, mission, and vision. So we try to make sure that we are responsive, empowering, and trustworthy, which helps us in our mission to help libraries become connected and innovative, which ultimately leads to our overall vision of public libraries thriving as community leaders. And that is our ultimate goal, is to do whatever we can to help your library thrive as a community leader where you are at. So taking a look here, there we go, it's a little fancy as certain buttons on my computer here. So this is a little of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through some of the founding principles, where librarianship relies upon, how it becomes what it is. We'll take a look at the responsibilities and roles of you as a board member. We'll also take a look at the relationships you will have with various components as a board member. We'll delve into advocacy a little bit, cover a little tiny bit on records management, and then there's a section at the end on legal information as it relates to book challenges. That has been added because those things have, there's been an uptick in that as we've advanced in years here recently, and so it's just good information to have so that you're aware of where legality sits when it comes to those kind of things. So let's go ahead and delve into founding principles. So ultimately, libraries and what we do can be found in the First Amendment. You have Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, which is where we live, and or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances, all the way back to 1789. So that freedom of speech piece actually also equates to freedom of information exchange and access to information, which is very much where the libraries live. And then all of this extends from the federal government to each individual state via the 14th Amendment. So sometimes when you have conversations around this, folks are like, well, that's great, but that's the federal government. What does that got to, yeah, we got to pay attention to that. We shouldn't do all the things that would be wrong to violate that, but what else? And so if we actually want to scale it down, you can see that this same freedom of speech piece is actually found in Virginia's Bill of Rights, which predate federal one. So in 1776, these were adopted, and you have those same freedoms of speech in Section 12, and then Section 17 helps kind of enumerate things a little bit further with an open-ended protection, so that just because something isn't listed in all of these Bill of Rights doesn't mean that it's not a right that is still protected. So again, these were adopted in 1776, ratified in 1791. Section 12 has very similar language to what's found in the federal First Amendment. So it's kind of nice to see that Virginia, as the state, as a commonwealth, kind of espouses those same things that occur on the federal level. And even beyond kind of domestic law within the United States or in our state, libraries align with various global standards. So in the case of a larger kind of body, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is something that many countries sign on to, Article 19 specifically states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. And this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek and receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. So that was way back in 1948 is when that came to fruition. So these rights kind of ensure the protection of access to and sharing of ideas, which is a foundational component of what libraries do. So from these major principles in state, federal, and global law, we can take a look at how libraries and our premier professional organization for libraries in the United States has translated them into specific guidelines for the profession. And so these are items that have been produced by the American Library Association, ALA. ALA is the primary professional association for libraries and librarians, just in the same way that the American Medical Association exists and the American Bar Association exists for those groups. This is where kind of that professional piece exists here. And so the Library Bill of Rights was adopted in 1939, last amended in 2019, and it sets up principles that establish libraries as kind of those places for information and ideas, ensuring that everybody has equal access to this and that materials are not censored based on origin, background, or views. We are a place where people can gather information, whatever information it is that they seek to have. A document that goes along with that, a supplementary document, if you will, is the interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. So this kind of is a good document for when you have specific questions that come up. It was last amended in 2025 and gives guidance on a variety of topics. So one that's in there is rating systems. Like in various cases, there have been folks have wanted to have libraries put rating systems on books, right, to help people navigate what's good for me, what's not good for me, those kind of things over time. And taking a look at our Library Bill of Rights, the interpretation therein is that while it might seem innocent enough, libraries are not necessarily in the business of deciding for its patrons what is appropriate for them. We trust our patrons to decide for themselves and to form their own opinions as to what they do and do not want to read and or seek as far as information goes. Other pieces that are important to know about, you have a Freedom to Read statement, which was adopted in 1953 and last amended in 2004, that defends the right to read and opposes censorship, that a wide variety of viewpoints is crucial for a healthy democracy, and that a free exchange of ideas is vital to society. A companion document to that, the Freedom of View Statement, came about in 1990, very similar in its execution. That became a thing when we started to lend media materials. So when VHS tapes started to hit the shelves, it's something that you could check out from the library. And the final document that's kind of just important to know about is Libraries and American Value, that was adopted in 1999. It states that libraries are a core American value because, again, they provide that free and equitable access to information, fostering education, democracy, and community. Now, at the bottom of this slide and the others that you might be able to read it where you are. If you're not, that's okay. I mentioned that these are not referenced in your bylaws. They do not have to be referenced in your bylaw. These are not required reading necessarily. I do like to include the information as to if they are or are not in the bylaws, because sometimes we have boards who have this information in their bylaws saying we will abide by these particular principles, and yet the board doesn't know that these particular documents exist or they haven't read through them at any point. I would recommend if you have a chance to kind of go through those just so that you're familiar with what they are. They do contain a lot more information, obviously, than I'm providing on screen as far as details into what goes into kind of just the underpinnings of what librarianship is and what libraries are really about. So I'm going to continue to move forward here into our next section on responsibilities. So, as a board member, you have a variety of responsibilities. So a big one is to employ. You are to employ a competent and qualified library director and to maintain an ongoing performance appraisal for the director. You are responsible for the oversight of that particular position. You are also responsible for the mission of the library, to determine the mission, goals, and objectives of the library and adopt written policies governing the library. That is where you live. Making sure that the library stays on mission, that it's following the goals and objectives, moving everything forward. Along with that mission is planning pieces. So ensuring that the library has a long-range planning process that considers the library's strengths and weaknesses and can be implemented and evaluated. Part of the actual Code of Virginia is that every library system within the state is responsible for producing a 5-year strategic plan every 5 years. And that plan, which is usually created with community input, of which includes individuals like yourselves, some staff input, larger kind of group input altogether, is kind of distilled into those goals and objectives, and that is what drives the library forward for the next 5 years. It informs everything from the services you're going to offer, where you're going to spend your money, all of those things involved. So that planning document, the living document, should be the thing that's helping guide everything forward. Another major thing is the laws. You should be familiar with local, state, and federal library law. Actively supporting pending library legislation that is going to benefit the library, and opposing anything that might actually damage the library as it come forward. So we're going to cover a little bit of the federal law piece as it relates to book challenges later, as I mentioned before. Local and state sometimes can be a little bit easier to come by, but federal is a behemoth, so there are certain things that are just important to kind of know. Another component of your responsibilities is the public relations. So ultimately the phrase is like establish, support, and participate in a planned public relations program. This is primarily protecting the library's reputation, right? Making sure that the public relations of the library remain positive, that the library still continues to be that trusted, universal community center type opportunity for everybody who lives in their community. The next is board meetings. You should be attending them, so good job to everybody who's able to be here right now. And making sure that accurate records are kept on file at the library of those meetings. The board meeting minutes, those are things that are essential to be kept. It kind of delineates the business of what's going on. It's also something that needs to be made available to the public because we are a public entity, and so the public has a right to view those minutes. Next up is continuing education. Just like you want a director and the staff of your library to continuously learn and to know more about their profession and what's going on and how they can move the library forward so that it's not stagnant. As a board, it's also important to participate in continuing education opportunities. Now, these can be larger things where you're attending a particular conference or a webinar on something, but they also could just be educating yourself on the various services that are available at the library. It's always inevitable, I mean, no matter how long, unless you actually work at the library, there's a plethora of things that go on. Sometimes they're better known than other pieces, and so by knowing the library and participating in continuing education in that fashion, you can better understand decisions that you need to make and kind of guide the library going forward. And that leads directly into services, really. Again, knowing the services that your library provides, it means that you can talk about them better. If you're speaking to somebody in the community, you can make recommendations like, hey, did you know that we have this? If somebody's saying, hey, I was struggling with this, or I'm trying to find resources on that, based upon what you know, you can then kind of move things along. Another item is reporting. So report regularly to the officials that you need to, and to the general public as a whole, making sure that meeting minutes are up and available for folks. If anybody has any questions, we can report out. And then a really big one, obviously, is funding. This is a world that obviously moves because of money. We even though the library does offer things for free, we don't operate on the free principle. So making sure that you're securing adequate funds to carry out the library's program, assisting the preparation of the annual budget as it kind of moves forward, and officially approve budget requests as they come across. So those are your primary responsibilities as a board member. And I want to pause here if there are any questions before we move into the next section. I'm not hearing anything. So, I mean, if you do have something, like raise your hand or something, because I can't see any of the signs. So, all right. So, not hearing anything, I'm going to go ahead and continue to move forward. So, the next big section is on relationships. We do not operate in a vacuum. Everybody has to know somebody and has to work with folks. So, relationships are another major component of being a board member. So, a big one is obviously the relationship between the board and the director. A big thing is to not micromanage. The board lives at a 50,000-foot level. You are not responsible for the operations of the library. That is what the director is for. So you've hired the director. It's important to let the director do their job. If you do want to get involved in the running of the library, then that's a separate role. That would be applying for a job to work at the library. Your job exists a bit higher in the oversight portion of it, in the larger governance piece of things. It's important to ask questions and seek clarification. So do ask all of the questions that you might have about why something operates the way it is. Why are we doing this thing? But also allow the director to do the same. Sometimes they receive direction from a board, and it might be a little bit murky or may not have all of the details in there. Allowing the director to follow up, to ask the questions they need to make sure that they understand fully what the direction that you're given is, means that they can move forward confidently and you will have the result that you're looking for. If you're not allowed to ask questions as a director, that can lead to a lot of conflict, and it can sometimes bring a lot of projects to a screeching halt, because you might start down one particular direction and then the board comes back and says, that's not what we meant at all. But if they weren't allowed to ask any questions, how is the director supposed to understand exactly what's going on? When it comes to the review portion, which again, you're responsible for the hiring and the evaluation of the director, address any issues early, right? You don't want to wait for their annual review to bring something up, especially if it's something that could have been addressed 7 months ago. Sometimes there might be things going on that the director is not aware of, or it might just not occur to them. So addressing things early means that if it's something that it could lead to a bigger issue, you'll stop it, nip it in the bud early, so you're able to kind of take care of that. And again, nobody likes to walk into their annual review and be blindsided with things. Just giving folks an opportunity to change service, change the behavior, whatever it is. Early is always going to be better. And the last big thing is to be invested in the director's success, because their success is your success. The part of the role of the board is to support the director in their, in the things that they're doing and moving forward. So again, their success is going to be your success. So another relationship that the board has is with board and staff. One second, I'm going to take a drink of water. Now, it's not often that you're going to work directly with staff, but there are important components in that relationship that you need to be aware of. One is that any and all instructions for staff must go through the director. There is at no point any reason necessary where a board member is giving instructions for work to be done to a staff member directly. That is the role of the director. Now, if you have a suggestion for something, you can talk to the director about it, but the director will know best, one, if that person is responsible for doing the thing, if it's the best time to do the thing, if they have the money to do the thing. And in the case of staff, if they know you're a board member, they may just be like, oh my God, the board member has told me to do something, I must do it right away. And that may lead to conundrums later. So again, any and all instructions for staff needs to go through the director, because the director is responsible for the operations and the work direction of what takes place in the library. Another item is that no trustee should intervene between staff and the director if there's an issue. We do want staff members to kind of bring something up, but if they do bring something up, any trustee needs to redirect said staff member to the established grievance procedure and board policy. There should be a policy and procedure involved. because what might be occurring next may be an HR issue, and you want to make sure that everybody is following the rules correctly. So if somebody brings you something, say, I appreciate that, please go through this particular policy and procedure. Make sure that you understand what those are as a director, or I'm sorry, as a board member, so that it can be something you can reference if you need to. It's also important that those grievance policies and procedures, that the end game of that doesn't actually just stop at the director. There's a lot of them that are, but sometimes, not often, not a lot, but sometimes the director can be the person causing the issue. There's a misappropriation of funds or something like the news, headline worthy kind of thing that we don't want to see. So having that available is always going to be a good thing for staff. Now, trustees are probably going to work with staff on various committees, long-range planning, and library social events. That's a lot of where the interaction is going to be. And so that's great, have the chance to get to know them. They are essential in making sure that the library runs and runs well. Without library staff, it truly is just kind of a warehouse of things. So you need staff, and you need, folks to be able to do the work and make the library come alive. And much like, investing in the success of your director, being interested in the work that's being done at all of the various levels at the library is really important, because the staff makes the library what it is. Without them, nothing moves, nothing happens. It's just a giant building full of stuff. And we like it when it's a community where folks are able to kind of learn and grow and get to know different things about the community and themselves and each other and so on and so forth. So another relationship that you will have is between the board and, in your case, for Jamerson. Sorry, that your friends group is called the Appomattox County Library Association, and so my brain almost called you the Appomattox Regional Library, which I know you are not. But when you have Appomattox as a town, but a different town has a title, it gets a little confusing from my point. But it's going to be your relationship between the board and then your friends group. And to my knowledge, again, we don't have a foundation, but that's okay, not as necessary. But you have your friends groups and foundations are separate 501c3 entities that serve as fundraising arms of the library. They are adjacent to the library, but they are not of the library. They're not part of the library. And so relationships between these entities and the board of trustees and the library itself are very important. Those collegial relationships means you are expanding the pool of advocates when something might come up that you need to kind of rally the troops for the library. It's also maintaining those collegial relationships is important because the Friends group has additional funding, and you want to make sure that they are happy to provide the funding. That is what they are for, but sometimes those relationships are not always as collegial, and that can cause them to, various Friends groups to not want to give the money to the library to do the things that the library needs to have done. So always having strong collegial relationships is important. This is why, if possible, I always recommend that there is a board liaison to the Friends and the Foundation, and vice versa, where there is a Friends and Foundation liaison to the library board, and that those folks are attending those meetings on a regular basis, because then you can hear directly from the Friends group about the liaison, about what's going on. They can take information back to their board. You can hear things that are going on at the Friends board meetings, and so on and so forth. So that it's not necessarily a game of telephone, what went on, somebody else is telling you. You've actually had people who are at the meetings hearing everything from right away. And then the last kind of big relationship is with everybody else. So trustees are public representatives of the library, and as such, whatever you do and say may reflect upon the library. Not sure you kind of knew that when you signed on to the role, but right now, if somebody knows that you're associated with the library, anything you do or say may be reflected back upon you, and that's important to keep in mind as we kind of come back to that public relations piece earlier. Just something to be conscious of when when it comes to social media, when it comes to any kind of opinion you have or things of that sort. everything you do and say now, any action you take, every opinion you have, may be seen as a reflection of the library. Another thing that's important to note is that board decisions need to be reflective of what the library and community needs, and that may not necessarily always align with an individual trustee need or belief. As a trustee, it's essential to kind of remain open and objective as possible. We want you to bring your experience and your expertise to the table, but sometimes the library may not always move in the direction that you necessarily believe it should move in. And this kind of melts us into the last item on here, which is that after a board makes a decision, it needs to speak with one voice. Everybody brings that wealth again of experience and expertise to the table, and that is wonderful for conversations and debate and decision making, because then you are having a robust conversation with a lot of different viewpoints. But when the final decision is made, whatever that decision is, the board needs to speak with one voice. Again, as a public representative, it weakens the board's standing if the different things are relayed to the public. If somebody who didn't necessarily agree with the decision decides to go out and speak on something completely different, then you start to have a game of telephone or a grapevine where it's like there's warring taking place between board members. Those kind of things. You can definitely make your opinions known and your thoughts known. If you want to write a piece of dissent in the minutes, those kind of things, but it's important that the board speaks with one voice afterwards so as to dissuade any confusion for what might be happening moving forward. Now again, I'm going to pause here before we kind of delve into the next section, which is advocacy. Are there any questions?
I have a question. Cindy, I have one question. On the funding, is that limited to monetary donations, or would the library be able to accept in-kind donations? Books or gifts or equipment, things like that?
What the library does on your individual budget is kind of, I don't have that as much information. Cindy might be able to answer that, but I do believe normally any funding, any budget that a library has is going to have multiple streams. You will have donations, you will have money that's coming in from the state, you will have your local dollars, so there's going to be a variety of things. Cindy might be able to speak a little bit more clearly as to the budget pieces.
Yes, we do accept donations of
would think,
books, equipment, all of that.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you. Again, you guys are on like a postage stamp on my screen here. So, all right. So advocacy. Advocacy. The word. I don't always love the word advocacy, but what it is really is just telling the library story. So you're going to be a vocal, visible, and well-informed trustee. You're going to utilize the library and spread the word about the good things that are taking place there. It just means talking to individual groups about the library. So if you are also a member of a Lions Club or Elks or Rotary or something like that, you can tell them about what it is, what the library is doing, or what it means to be a trustee in the library. It's working closely with your local officials according to the library's plan. Again, you have that planning document that you're supposed to be working from. They're telling the people about being a trustee. Jump in on that one a little bit, but it's also selling the philosophy and merits of a high-quality library service. You know all of the things that are taking place in the library and how they can benefit the community, but not everybody else sees that all the time. So talking about how the library does all of these things, how it benefits the community at large, and how if we got more money, we could do these other things here that would benefit the library and the community even more. Those kind of things. And it's also supporting the Friends of the Library. In your case, no foundation, but if you did, that would also be part of those things. So, why is it important for trustees to advocate? The big things here are that you are going to see the library from the user's viewpoint. Staff and the director have a different kind of perspective, and so we're also going to be the folks who are like, of course you should do all the things at the library. We know all the things, but trustees are seeing it from a user viewpoint. You should have a perspective on the full range of library services. Doing your continuing education, learning more about what's taking place, that'll help with that. You, as the board, you represent a broad base of consumers, so it should be coming from different perspectives on what the needs are for the community. You are volunteer participants in your government. Good job. And hopefully you are voters. But these are all components as to why trustees are kind of great advocates for the library. But the key to all of this is you, right? The word you. As a community member, when it comes to talking about the library and why it's great and why it could always use more funding or these kind of things or so on and so forth, folks are sometimes more inclined to hear from a trustee than they would, say, a quote-unquote perceived government official, like the folks who work there, because sometimes they might see, you know, if Cindy or her staff are saying, hey, we need more money, they might just be like, well, you just want more money for your job. Frankly, I don't know anybody who doesn't want more money for their job, but usually when a staff member is talking about that, or they're talking about like they need more funding, it's not usually for their own salaries. They're talking about, hey, we want to do this great project. It's going to benefit the community in workforce development or economic standards or so on and so forth. So again, sometimes having a trustee advocate who is participating and is kind of a proponent of the library, the words will be accepted in a greater fashion than if it comes from a staff member. So, how and when to advocate? So, how do I advocate? In every conversation you have promoting the library and its services. And when do I advocate? In every conversation you have promoting the library and its services. So, the short answer is the same, but the longer answer is obviously going to be different. Both of these things is always when appropriate. That is a little piece that's not listed there. But in the how, you can invite local, regional, and like state legislators and stakeholders to events and programs. Always write them thank you letters after they pass funding for libraries. We all just, with the state having just passed its budget, all the public libraries got state aid, for this next fiscal year. So thank you letter to your representatives to say thank you for signing on to this, for allowing us to have this money. We're going to be able to do these kind of things moving forward. You can assist with summer reading. Sometimes they need extra bodies because those events and those things can be kind of big after a while. You're going to be helping present the local budget to the budget to local officials. Talking about the services. Again, just talking about what the library does and why it's important and why folks should show up to things. And then again, the when is any time you feel it's appropriate. Don't just wait for budget meetings. Be visible at your kind of locality meetings. Show up on the dates when you're not necessarily set to speak, because sometimes you'll hear things that might come up as opportunities or things that you might need to be aware of that could affect things at the library down the line. And then again, it's just making those connections with your kind of local community partners. If you're in the Rotary and you hear an opportunity that the library could be a part of or to support, it's a great new partnership opportunity, that kind of thing. So there are some ways to kind of keep up with advocacy. The Virginia Library Association has a legislative committee. They have an advocate action alert mailing list. This is something that you sign up for. You only get alerts if there is a major piece of kind of legislation that's taking place that could affect the library. Because again, you're not going to be bombarded with things. It's just if something comes up that could affect the library. There's an intellectual freedom committee that is also part of the Virginia Library Association. I produce a monthly Trustees, Friends, and Foundation newsletter. The link on here is actually for the archives of that. That comes out in the middle of the month. Nationally, there is the Public Library Association has an advocacy page where you can learn more things. There is something called Turning the Page. This is supporting libraries and strengthening communities. This is an actual kind of advocacy training curriculum and resources if you're interested in that. And then every library is I'm going to read directly from my notes here because I want to make sure I get this right. It's a nonpartisan pro-library organization that offers pro bono consulting and support, working with public and school libraries on funding. And they also track legislation of concern across the U.S., so taking a look at what's going on there in the larger landscape of things. And now we're going to head into records management. So the nitty-gritty of things and the not quite so fun part of the role, but it is very essential. So before we kind of delve into that again, any questions at all?
No.
Okay, thank you. So records management, why is this important? Why do I want to do this? Do I have to do this? It is the permanent record of the business of the library, and so as public stewards, we need to pay attention to that. And should they wish to, the public has the right to request any and all public records. And as a public body, the library is accountable to the public. And then another big reason is that mismanagement of these records, it can reflect poorly on the library. The library is one of the last kind of government entities that people still have a good deal of trust in, and so we tend to want to keep that reputation of being good stewards of public funds, and we don't want to break the trust in the institution. And so again, that's kind of where that kind of the why behind records management. More specifically, the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, in Virginia, specifically states that the General Assembly ensures the people of the Commonwealth have ready access to public records in custody of a public body, see libraries, or its officers and employees, and free entry to meetings of public bodies wherein the business of the people is being conducted. So again, this includes public libraries because we receive taxpayer funds. So in that public meeting realm, what actually constitutes a public meeting under FOIA? So it is any time that 3 board members are gathered and discussing topics. So you have your official meetings like now, but if you step outside and 3 of you are discussing something that happened in the meeting, that could be construed a public meeting. So just kind of keep the business of the discussion of what's taking place in the library in more formal occasions. You can certainly gather together outside. You all want to go for ice cream or something because it's ridiculously hot outside. But don't discuss the business of the library and those kind of things. It's also important to note what constitutes a public record under FOIA. That is any writing, images, or recordings in any format that are prepared or owned by or in the possession of a public body or its agents being done in the transaction of public business. So that's a lot of things. It covers a lot of ground with that. So anything that's kind of being done in the transaction of the public business in a variety of formats, not just the meetings and those kind of things. And when it comes to retention, there are specific what they call schedules that have been developed by our records management group here at the Library of Virginia. They set the standards for the state, across every single agency that's kind of takes place here. And so for the libraries, there are 2 that they follow. One is on public library records specifically, so patron records and how long to keep those kind of things. That's called GS-22. But GS-19 is the one that you all are going to need to pay attention to a little bit. This is for records and retention disposal of any document related to county and municipal government administrative records. So administrative records is the board information lives. And again, the Library of Virginia developed it in accordance with the Virginia Public Records Act of the Code of Virginia. And then if you have any questions, there is usually a kind of local or regional person who assists with records retention and records management. But if you have any questions at all, you can always reach out to folks here at the Library of Virginia. In the records management team, different people I think are assigned to different libraries, so I'm not quite sure who your person might be. However, if you're just like, who do I talk to, you can definitively email somebody from our team, because we work with y'all on a more regular basis, and we can put you in contact with the records management team if you have any questions. So, I kind of want to delve into something that is the most common mode of communication, and that is email. So, as a board member, you are responsible for managing the emails you send and receive. Now, if I'm not mistaken, last time I spoke to folks, the library does not issue board-specific email addresses, correct, Cindy?
We can if we need to.
Okay. So if you are utilizing your own personal email for your communications regarding board relations and being a board member, you need to try and make sure that you are keeping track of that, because the request from the public, if a FOIA request comes in, anything that you are doing, regardless if it's in your personal email or from an email address that is assigned to you from the library, those requests must be honored the same as any other public record request. And that email must remain accessible during the entire retention period. So even if you've gone off of the board, if the schedule says you need to keep it for 3 years after the end of the calendar year, you can't just delete it when you go home. That's sometimes why we recommend, if possible, and if the library board decides to do this, it's not required, but sometimes having an email address that is a dedicated one with the library means that when you're done, the library retains all of that. You don't need to worry about keeping things separate in your own email account, or when you can get rid of things, or accidentally deleting something at any point. It just kind of lives with the library, and then they take care of that afterwards. Some tips when it comes to email, regardless of what account you're using. If you are kind of conversing as a board member, try and use an official signature. Say you are a board member or board chair, and then what library you're with. A lot of times I get contacted by folks who might sit on the trustees, friends board, or foundation board, and in nowhere in the email do they tell me who they are, as in what library are you contacting me about. That little extra information helps us kind of place where everybody is, but it also, this is if you're kind of doing things in your official capacity as a board member, it's just an extra component. Proofread for typos. If you remove the letter L from the word public, it becomes a very different word, and autocorrect is not going to catch that for you. Anybody who's worked in the public library has had that happen to them at some point in time, but it's just a good rule of thumb. Please make sure you're reading through everything. When it comes to all of the emails that you're exchanging back and forth, retain that kind of final email in a thread in a dedicated board email folder. Now you can chunk it out by year or however you want to do it, but put everything, both what you send out and what you receive, into a dedicated board folder. So in case you do get a FOIA request, you can go back and kind of pull all of that information. Do use a useful subject line. Knowing what the email is about before you even open it helps folks to triage things. You can use things like urgent if it's something that needs to go really quickly. It's just kind of an extra good rule of thumb. And another big one is do not put something in an email that you would not want to see in tomorrow's newspaper. Again, FOIA request. So anything that you don't think should be a headline is not something that you should put in an email at any point in time. We're going to go ahead and head into kind of legal information regarding book challenges. But before we delve into this, are there any other questions?
Doesn't look like it.
So, again, this section was created just to provide some more kind of information as to the legal components that folks need to be aware of when book challenges come in. And so, as caveats, this is legal information only, not legal advice. I am not a lawyer, so I will not give legal advice, and you shouldn't take the things that I say as legal advice. The information in here, though, was put together by Teresa Kamara, who is the legal counsel for the Freedom to Read Foundation, so she's an actual lawyer. So she compiled this and it kind of initially shared the information. And if you do have any formal legal questions, please consult your local legal counsel. Do not ask Reagan. I am not a lawyer. I will not be any great help whatsoever. So, harkening back to our very first slide, I want to just cover again the First Amendment pieces when it takes a look at that larger legal landscape. It states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. It applies to adults as well as minors. Sometimes I think that gets lost because minors don't gain their rights at any particular time. It's not like a license at 16 or being able to drink at 21. They have them the same as adults do. It protects not only the right to speak, but also the right to receive information. It applies to government entities, not to private entities. And it applies to all speech unless designated an unprotected category by the U.S. Supreme Court. And those unprotected categories are obscenity, harmful to minors, child pornography, false advertising, defamation, truth, threats, and fighting words. Again, those are the only unprotected categories of speech. And legal folk have to define those, not everybody on the street. So, let's take a look at some of the different kind of legal cases out there and how they impact things when it comes to book challenges. So, kind of starting off with that unprotected categories of speech, the Miller v. California from 1973. This is a big one. Colloquially, it's kind of referred to as the Miller test. And so the U.S. Supreme Court has held that the First Amendment does not protect obscene material. But in determining whether material is obscene or not, only a court gets to decide that. And material needs to be defined as obscene, needs to meet all three parts of the test. So the first is whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct specifically defined by the applicable state law. 2, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work as a whole appeals to prurient interest. And 3, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Not sure why I have scientific value in italics, that didn't make it clear. But the as a whole is a really important component. A lot of times when we have challenges come in, there might be a sentence here or a paragraph here that is kind of picked out of the entire work. And that isn't always the greatest way to examine an entire book. In the same way that any student does a book report, you ask them to read the whole book and to examine and kind of think about the book as a whole. We need to do that same thing when it comes to these pieces as a whole as well. And again, the court determines whether something is declared obscene or not any one individual. Another law to kind of be aware of, another case to be aware of rather, is Rosenberger v. Rector and Union of Visitors of the University of Virginia. This deals with viewpoint discrimination. It's a case from 1995. The First Amendment doesn't allow it. It does not allow viewpoint discrimination, and it is held that viewpoint discrimination is an egregious form of content discrimination. So kind of delving into that a little bit further when you have things like book removal, this is where you have Board of Education versus PICO from 1982. So in the context of determining whether a school library board impermissibly removed books from the collection, the U.S. Supreme Court held that if the library, quote unquote, intended by removing the books to bar access to ideas with which they disagreed, then that removal is unconstitutional. We can't just move books to another section or those kind of things just because we may not agree with the ideas that are contained within, because it violates the First Amendment. Building off PICO in that kind of book removal is a case called Mainstream Loudon versus the Board of Trustees at Loudon, and this is from 1998, and that is Loudon, Virginia. The court held that, quote, the First Amendment applies to and limits the discretion of the public library to place content-based restrictions on access to constitutionally protected materials within its collection. And that goes on further down, that a public library, like other enterprises operated by the state, may not be run in such a manner as to prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. Other cases, segregation of materials burdens First Amendment rights. So this is from the case Sun v. City of Wichita Falls from 2000. The district court held that the forced removal of books from the children's room to adult section of the library placed a significant burden on library patrons' ability to gain access to those books. So if you are not being able to, if the library is no longer able to provide access to the books, that can be a violation of the First Amendment. And taking a look a little bit further into that, into the parental rights piece, in that same thing, or in that same case, they talk about, in response to the argument that parents have the right to remove material with which they disagreed, the district court stated that, quote, if a parent wishes to prevent her child from reading a particular book, that parent can and should accompany the child to the library, and should not prevent all children in the community from gaining access to constitutionally protected materials. This is important to note because parental rights is quoted often when you're talking about kind of book challenges, and the library is actually pro parental rights. We want you to come in with your kids and to have the conversations with them about what you feel is appropriate for them to be reading or not reading. What this means, though, is that individuals have that responsibility for their own family units. There is no one individual or entity that should be telling any other parent what they can and cannot have for their own kids. So if we start to delve in that direction, that again becomes a violation of the First Amendment. Something to keep in mind if you do end up in cases, the cases that are actually kind of take place, is that it can be expensive. If a library or other state entity is sued for a violation of First Amendment rights and the plaintiff is successful in winning the case, you can be responsible for not only the cost of your own litigation and fees for your attorneys, but the other side as well. And that can be a lot. So if the Fayetteville Public Library versus Crawford County case, Crawford County was ordered to pay more than $400,000 in attorney's fees to the plaintiffs. This is not including their own costs, so an additional $400,000. And that kind of delineation when it comes to attorney's fees comes from 42 U.S.C. section in 1983. So I'm going to go through some of the more recent cases so that you can kind of gain an idea of what happened out in kind of a larger landscape. It's going to be a lot of information, so I'm going to try and go through it as quickly as possible. But there is a Crawford County, which I just mentioned before. Crawford County, Arkansas has had two kind of cases come up. There's Fayetteville Public Library versus Crawford County, and that handles things, began way back in 2023, and there's some ongoing components from it. But that began with Arkansas's Act 372, which had two sections in it that imposed different kind of restrictions. One was imposing criminal penalties on librarians, booksellers, and anybody who quote-unquote makes available materials that are deemed quote-unquote harmful to minors without really defining what that is. So basically any librarian could be locked up or have to, pay $15,000 or something like that for a book if anybody found it to be harmful to minors without having a definition on that. That can be kind of just dangerous as a whole because the definition without it being clearly defined, who's to say what that is? So when that came up, there were folks who sued on behalf of kind of everybody. So that included public libraries, librarians, patrons, booksellers, a whole gamut of folks. In December of 24, the federal district court struck down both of these sections in that act as unconstitutional, rejecting the argument that the library collection is government speech. And that was kind of appealed to the 8th Circuit Court in January 2025, and then kind of hasn't seen any real full movement since. And while that may have not passed in Arkansas, there are other states in which legislation like that has been introduced. So Indiana, Missouri, Idaho, so on and so forth. So applying criminal penalties to library staff who are just trying to do their job.
I have a question.
Yes.
The Board of Supervisors is the one locally who determines the budget for the town or the county, and if in resources are, I know we have other issues like water and that type of thing in our community that we have to deal with. Those funds can be reallocated towards other funding, and if there's money that is depleted from the library fund, communities are not required to have a library is what I'm trying to say. Those funds for the library, they could defund the library and completely eliminate the library if the library's goals do not meet that of a community. That's not against the law.
No, that's correct.
That can be done.
Correct. That can be done in any community.
Right.
Because it's not a violation for a locality to take their dollars or decide that they don't want the library anymore.
Right.
Part of the Code of Virginia, in order to receive state funding, the locality must meet a particular, I don't know the exact formula, but it has to meet certain match or a certain standard. And if it doesn't, then the library no longer receives funding. So yes, if a community decided that they wanted to close the library, they certainly are able to do so. That's not, in my kind of biased opinion, always the greatest, because the library provides a lot of opportunities and a lot of space and services that are not necessarily found in other avenues within the communities, but it is definitely something that could occur. Other questions?
No, we're good.
Okay. So moving into the Verdon v. Crawford County, This is a case in which began in 2023. In a case where there was board action, they directed the librarian to move books within the public library that had LGBTQIA plus themes to a social section, is what they called it. These included picture books and YA books, and then the library, they were sued by library patrons. The district court granted a summary judgment to the plaintiffs, holding that the removal was unconstitutional because it places a burden of the kind of barriers to access, so within that First Amendment piece, and rejects the argument that the library collection is government speech.
Okay, I have a question. Do you mind if I?
One more question.
Okay, so if you have a conservative community like Appomattox, which is 70% conservative, you look at our political leanings in our community, and that's gonna have to come up today, where you have the community outcrying that they're saying that they don't, they're looking at materials that are presented and displays in children's areas that are not acceptable to that community. From what I hear, you're saying we can either choose to be sued by having these materials in our libraries that don't meet the community's needs, or we have another choice, if we don't want to be sued, is to defund the library altogether. Is that basically two options?
Well, I would never want to say anything black and white because I am not in charge of what goes on in your community or how.
But I think that's what you're saying, if that's okay for me to assert that, is that we either have to have LGBTQ grooming materials in our libraries in a conservative community that does not want that and to receive state funding, or we have to defund and completely eliminate all funding for the library to avoid all of us being sued, because we are being forced to have a library that doesn't meet the needs of a community but is meeting the needs of Richmond, who's dictating the legislation coming out of Richmond. It sounds like there's really no middle ground from what you're saying.
Well, we don't determine what you can put in your collection. We have absolutely nothing to do with that. Collection development is done by each individual library. We don't determine the money you receive from us on the state library side. That is not a caveat. We don't make determinations of what goes in your collection or not. We have absolutely no control or authority over that.
Okay, may I ask a follow-up question?
I think
Can I ask a follow-up
Go
question,
ahead.
if you don't mind? Do you mind if I ask? Okay, a follow-up question, so then I think what I'm hearing, if I'm clear, but I'm just trying to understand this better, is that if a community decides collectively that they want to purchase books that align with the community values, that's acceptable. But if you have a minority of the community that wants, how do you meet the needs of the entire community and not be sued?
So, I can't guarantee that you won't be sued. I mean, there's no way that I would know that. I know kind of what I'm relaying here is an information as far as these are the laws that are in place. Any library can make decisions as to what they want to have as far as their policies and governance goes. However, if you do move in a particular direction and someone feels that violates their First Amendment rights, they may sue you. Now, that's not always the case, but that is a possibility. And one of the reasons that I add this to a board success training is so that folks are just aware that those are possibilities.
Okay,
Because we've had
sorry.
boards that
A lot of questions here.
I think I have an answer to your question.
Well, I have one more question before we do that. While it's fresh on my head before I forget it. Typically in government services, when you are serving in the capacity of a government official in your position, at the local level, your Commonwealth's attorney would represent you. You would not personally be held liable or sued. That would be the role of the Commonwealth's attorney. Or if you're in state government, you have the Attorney General's office that defends you. You are not personally sued for if someone from the community decides that they want to sue you.
I would see the board, I think.
I'm sorry, I thought I heard somebody else speak, so I wanted to make sure.
I think that would sue the board as
Not
a
an
unit,
individual
right?
basis.
Yeah. So I think one of the answers to that, in order to straighten this all out is, within the policy of the library, you can